Hello again. Hello. Hint, hint. So now we have another talk, now by Wookey, talking about the 2038 problem.
.2038 is a problem. So just a quick recap for those of you who are not familiar what the problem actually is. Unix time counts in seconds and is a signed 32-bit number. So you get to about 2 billion and it rolls over, it turns out. So that's January 2038, which seemed a long way in the future in 1970 when somebody made this up, but is now only 14 years away, which is not all that long actually. There are other things which will go wrong to do with wrapping numbers. Most of them are unsigned, so you get an extra 70 years, so we can ignore those for now. FAT apparently will break. Slightly more worrying is the NTP time spec runs out 2 years before this does, but that's not my problem, so I'm not quite sure. That sounds really bad to me, but I'm hoping there's a new spec and there's a plan. But anyway, so I'm not really much of an expert about this, but it needs fixing, and I took an interest. So I will endeavour to explain to you what we know about the problem. Last time I did this was at FOSDEM, and quite a lot has developed since then. We know more, and we've made some decisions. So I will explain those to you, and you can tell me whether it's a terrible plan or not. So how big a problem is this really? How many people care about 32-bit? So this operating systems and their time running out. Obviously, most real computing is 64-bit these days, but there is still quite a lot of 32-bit computing, mostly in the cost-sensitive end of things, and stuff that just gets installed and left. You know, again, quite a lot of the stuff that will break in 2038 is probably already installed in aeroplanes, cars, buildings, process control systems, all that stuff that doesn't get updated very often, doesn't get redesigned very often, and doesn't get updated once you plugged it in. The plain people particularly we probably should worry about. But anyway, so yeah, there's stuff. Now, not very many of that stuff is based on Debian-style binary distros either. Most of it's open embedded or Android or whatever else, small systems. Nevertheless, there probably are some Debian-based things. And again, the number of things which are going to be based on our stuff and haven't been built yet and designed and installed yet is even smaller. But nevertheless, we kind of have to fix the software for the people who will eventually realize they need to do updates. So it does matter. The number of people who care, so some 32-bit OSs are recent enough that they went, let's start with a 64-bit time. That'll be better, won't it? So they don't care. Red Hat don't care because they don't have any 32-bit Archies anymore. Most of the 32-bit Archies are kind of dead, so it probably doesn't matter much. In another 15 years, they'll be definitely dead, apart from, enthusiasts, which obviously we have some of. And then there's the source distros. It's relatively easy for them to just rebuild the world and go, here you are, here's the new version, we fixed it. They haven't got to do a transition from old world to new world like we have. So that pretty much leaves Debian ARMHF and the Raspbian people. There's an awful lot of 32-bit Pis, and they'll probably be around for a while. I don't know that anybody else really cares. Yes, sorry. I'm counting you as Debian for the purpose of this argument, but yes. So I think that is the set of people who have shown an interest. There are probably some more out there. So people have been thinking about this. It was pretty clear some time ago that this was a thing to be fixed, but it's taken a while. So the kernel people, Arne Bergman particularly, pestered people and did a load of work 5 years ago now. Turns out the Perl people fixed this in 2010, so full marks to them. Muzzle was done 3 years ago. glibc was done 2 years ago. So basically the core layers are kind of fixed. There's a plan. But distros building stuff need to actually build with all this turned on and in new world. And obviously there are probably other things we haven't discovered yet. There's two parts to this, I should explain. There's changing the ABI so that you can use 64-bit time, and then there's all the things that will actually go wrong when your time wraps, which very much depends on what your software does, and that won't go wrong until you use those new times, until you actually overflow. So which isn't necessarily in 2038, it's whenever you're looking at a date beyond then. So, I think you're off.
You talk about the things that are left, and you talk about those being mostly the small, cheap, readily available other than avionics stuff. How much of that is actually still going to be dependent on time to work versus could have a 64-bit time in order to work?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's quite a lot of software that doesn't care at all about it. It'll go wrong for 1 second when it wasn't monotonic, and then it'll be fine again. Is that what you mean?
Those systems that actually, they don't care about time at all.
Yes, obviously. Simple
which
enough
is
software.
what most of the simple systems, if your set-top box falls over for the second because it's wrapped around for its EPG, that's one thing. Do we really think that people are still deploying hardware and platforms that have a 32-bit time T that hasn't been fixed, that are still in existence today, that are still going to be operational then without the software vendor, the people actually using it, doing something about it with or without an underlying fix?
That was slightly too many dependent clauses for me to answer the question, I'm afraid. The ultimate answer is I don't know.
One reason why things will be affected in ways that you don't necessarily expect is if you call stat to probe whether a file exists even, or something like that. If the file exists and its time is not representable in your time T, it will fail with e-overflow.
Yes.
So even if your program doesn't know or care what the time is, if it tries to stat a file, it can still fail.
Yeah. You want the operating system to still work, basically.
And that might well affect more things than we think it will.
And every program that gets an error
We know you're loud, Ian, but you start his microphone.
every program we know that gets an error return from stat knows that doesn't necessarily mean the file doesn't exist, eh?
It might just mean that time T wrapped. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, there will probably be quite a lot of bugs like that. Various distros have spent a fair amount of time working out what they need to do about this. We started looking. Arndt tried in 2020 to rebuild Debian with 64-bit time T and found that basically he couldn't because glibc didn't do the right thing yet. Pretty much only the kernel had been fixed, and that was insufficient. I had to go last year, and it worked fine, and stuff seemed to build and generally run. In fact, I couldn't actually find anything that broke, which was surprising. Test coverage is a bit of a problem, actually. I did ask for some tests, and I haven't had anyone come back to me with any. It's quite difficult to tell what's going to break. There's a lot of things to test. But anyway, we realised that we needed to look at how much of the ABI is actually affected, which is what we've been doing for the last year or so since the FOSDEM talk. So just to explain how this works, so what glibc has done is arrange so that both the 32-bit and the 64-bit interfaces are available to software. So you don't get new glibc and you get 64-bit time T. You're not forced to use it. So software can choose at what point it wants to transition, which is good. There is also the utump stuff, which all has 32-bit time in it. And there's kind of a separate argument that I don't want to go into now, but oddly enough, quite a lot of people went, just use the systemd one because that works, and nobody cares about this. And other people go, but it's in POSIX. And you go, yeah, but it's kind of old and shit and from 25 years ago, and do we really need to do that? And a security risk, and no. Anyway, so people need to worry about that. It doesn't affect the ABI, so I don't care. And the large file system transition is quite closely tied to the time T transition because glibc says if you're using 64-bit time, you've got to use 64-bit file offsets. Not the other way around. We'll get to that in a mo. I didn't understand how any of this worked until I actually looked into it in some detail. But it turns out large file source enables both ABIs, and file offset bits makes you use the 64-bit ABI. And software can choose to do either of these things. Nearly everybody chooses to just switch to the 64-bit ABI and use it. But stuff that's switched early in this process, for example, zlib, actually makes both sets of functions available, and you can choose. So these two transitions kind of go together, and it would be nice to get the LFS thing done. It's been trundling along for 20 years, and we still have quite a lot of packages that haven't switched yet. So there was a little bit of a fluster towards in 2022 because GNU-lib just went, oh, if there's Time64 support, we should turn it on. So if you just rebuilt, suddenly your software switched, and that wasn't necessarily what you wanted. So anybody who got a new GNU-lib and stuck it into their auto tools in that time period suddenly got upgraded. So you'll find that a few things have already switched, like tar and core utils, I think, in Debian. But we all complained at them and went, this is a change you as an upstream want to make explicitly, not have made for you whilst you weren't watching. So this is the wrong way to do it. And it has been reverted, so it doesn't just happen to you anymore. So your ABI, if anything in your ABI uses time-t and exposes it to the world, so another library, or, a public function, and it's got time-t in it, then the ABI will change when time-t changes size. In principle, this applies to both library and ABIs and disk formats. But we think that most of the disk format things got fixed 20 years ago when everybody switched from i386 to AMD64, because if you saved a file and you wanted it to be read on somebody else's AMD64 machine, you made sure that the software would do the right thing. So I haven't yet found any. INN is the only thing I've come across that has a file format issue. There are probably some more out there. But we basically ended up concentrating on the ABI part of this. So it's just another ABI bump. There's a lot of them, but it's quite a big one because a lot of packages are affected. So there was this kind of fundamental, because two ways you can run at this problem. You can either update your existing architecture, just treating, libraries change their ABIs all the time, and then things that depend on them are rebuilt against the new library, and the ABI has changed slightly, and nobody notices, and that's all fine. This is just the same thing. It's just that the library is glibc, and that's at the bottom of the stack, so a lot of things end up depending on it. You could argue that we're changing the ABI for the architecture here, so that should have a new triplet. It's a different architecture. We should just rebootstrap from scratch, which in some ways is easier for a distro like us, but it's not really what anybody wants for various reasons, particularly users who've got a system. You don't want to have to change to a different architecture, reinstall, throw away all your stuff and start again, or cross-grade. So after some discussion, we have decided we're not doing the new ABI, new triplet thing. It's a terrible idea. Nobody else in the world cares apart from Debian, so it'll be a huge argument with all the kernel and toolchain and everybody else people. So we are doing a transition within the architecture. Now, to do that, basically, these two magic variables you have to set, which cause the new 64-bit functions to be the default. And you just have to set those somewhere, and everything you build with those set will use the new stuff. We've done big transitions like this before. We did libc 5 to libc 6 in, 2001 or 2 or something. The problem is that for something like this, which is primarily an ARM-HF problem, it affects all the architectures. So, within Debian. It's a bit of a disadvantage, but again, we've done this in the past. Turns out long double size on 4 architectures in 2007, and I know I didn't notice. Did anybody else? So apparently that transition went okay. We can do this. So as discussed, a lot of 32-bit architectures either have already switched or we don't care about them. But i386 is a bit of an issue. So there was a discussion about what to do, and most of that discussion ended up being about i386 because it kind of has two purposes. Both it's an architecture you can run on hardware of that type, but nearly nobody does that. It almost entirely still exists because people want to run old i386 stuff on it. And so they don't want the ABI to change because then you won't be able to run old i386 stuff on it. It won't work. So games and Wine32, basically. So after some argument, I think the Debian consensus was that we're going to leave i386 as it is, And if anybody wants to make better i386, moving with the times, they could do that. I don't think anybody cares enough to do that at this point, but that would be possible. So the plan is to switch all the 32-bit architectures, except i386, to 64-bit time, which is kind of unclean, but it is probably the most sensible thing to do. So how many packages are affected? So of Debian's 36,000 packages, source packages, 6,500 of them mention time t, 18%, so, quite a lot. But that's not the same as how many public ABIs change. And it turns out you can't just inspect your source to work this out, unlike most previous transitions where it was really obvious. You've actually got to build the headers and look with and without this turned on, and in fact with LFS turned on and off as well. So you have 3 flavors, and then compare the ABI you got. And there's a handy tool called ABI Compliance Checker that does this for you. I say we, but mostly the Ubuntu Foundations team have written a very impressive, scary shell script, which just has 1,000. If library name blah, here's the special bodgery you need to actually make it build. Because quite a lot of things don't just work right. We did an analysis. Initially, an awful lot didn't build. Now, still, quite a lot don't build. But of those 900 that are left, 450 of them don't have anything depending on them. I'm not quite sure why we have 450 libraries with no reverse dependencies, but we do. Although it turned out one of those was Perl, right, which actually has 700 things that use it, even though they don't depend on it directly because it's a virtual dependency. So, there are things to catch you out. So the answers from that analysis are we had 10,000 something -dev packages. About half of those were Rust and Golang and Haskell, which for various reasons, like compiling entirely statically or rebuilding everything every time, are not affected by this ABI problem. It's basically just the C stuff. About half of them don't care, nothing changes. About a quarter, 20% still just don't build, so we don't know. About 500 are definitely change, and about 100 change for LFS but don't change for time t. And of those libraries, about 5,000 to 6,000 packages depend on them. So that's quite a lot. And as I say, Perl, it turns out, basically all the things that have a Perl XS module have a virtual dependency on that particular flavor of the ABI. So at the moment, the 900 that we haven't yet tested, for the purpose of the transition, we have to assume that they will change. They are unsafe, which basically doubles the size of the transition, which is annoying. So if anybody is enthused, just build some headers and make our 663,000 line script a bit longer. That's actually really quite useful work because it saves a whole load of pointless package uploading, NMUing and building. So the plan is basically, as I understand it now, I turned out from this process that I do not understand how our transitions process works. I'm aware that we've done this several times in the past, but people who knew more than me, like Mr. Langasek, dealt with it. So I think I understand how it works now, but if what I say is wrong, feel free to correct me. So basically, we tell dpackage to set these magic variables at some point, and then we can NMU all the libraries that need to change, and basically you just change the name of the library from libfoo to libfoo t64, but you don't change the name of the dev package, so that the dependencies still depend on the right thing, and it all just works. And then once those have all built, you can upload, you just bin NMU on all architectures, all the dependencies, and then it transitions. Helmut wants to tell me that this is all mad.
Unfortunately, it doesn't work like... I should go to the camera. No, it doesn't exactly work like that. So for 64-bit architectures, we don't have to do this stance, and we're doing it anyway. So actually, the library gets renamed even on 64-bit architectures, but provides the old name. So that's kind of a smooth transition. And for 32-bit architectures, we really rename the library package to the T64 suffix. So it really does get renamed.
Yes.
On both architectures.
Yes. That's what I said. I was just saying we don't rename the binary dev package as well, right? You only rename the binary package.
We only the binary package.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the library also stays in the same place, unless I'm mistaken.
Yes.
So it's conflicts all the way down.
Yes. And the point of this process is that basically you can leave the stuff in the archive depending on the old libraries until the new one turns up, and you move them all together in one dollop. So, what else? As a side effect of this process, you get to delete all the old suffixes we have still left over. The C102s and the zlib1gs will finally disappear, which is nice. But of course, we'll add a whole part of T64s to hang around for a decade. Sorry about that. Obviously, there has to be, it's a sufficiently large transition. There needs to be a plan with the FTP masters about when this is going to happen. Because if you can make it happen over a reasonably short period, then you're not holding the archive up for absolutely everything for months on end. We can't do that. So it kind of needs to happen over a couple of weeks, really, or maybe 3 or 4, but no longer. I gather there has been discussion and people think this is reasonably feasible. So that's that. You can read a thread about how this is all supposed to work. There are some other things we kind of, that this issue affects. So NFS version 3 breaks, although some clients use signed things, so they get another 70 years. I don't know, there are still people using NFS version 3. Sorry, they have an unsigned thing, yes. But I think it depends on the client, which one it uses, right? It's up to people's software. So, INN was thought to be an issue, but it turns out their new file format puts the data in ASCII and therefore doesn't depend on the size of it, so well done them. But there is an older format which does actually have a time T in it, but it's not clear how many people are still using that. So then that's just a thing for that package to kind of go, oh, we upgrade over this version, there needs to be an explicit, like, reread my database and write it back out again kind of exercise. We were worried about wine, but now we decided we're leaving O386. That's all fine. That still works. Like I say, Perl turns out to be a thing, and that various other bits and bobs are broken, like fake time doesn't fake its time properly over the ABI change. APR breaks. Some things got fixed. PHP, it turns out, had an old time interface, which won't work at all. And the problem is that most of the old PHP is probably just out there on web servers running badly like it's always done. So I have no idea how much of that stuff there is. So the PHP people made a sensible interface quite a long time ago, but I don't know how much of the code out there is still using the old stuff and therefore might break. Yeah, and as I said earlier, we're really worrying about fixing the ABI so that people can then go on to fix any problems in their software later. That is largely 2 separate issues. And, of course, all the things that we don't actually know about yet. I was very worried when I started this process that there was going to be loads of stuff that would just break. Everyone thought this was too scary, everything. But actually, the more you look, the less you find. So I'm a lot less worried that this is going to be a disaster than I was a year ago. Helmut?
I happen to know something that does break. Maybe some of you know that I'm doing something about this user merge, and it's quite sensitive to restructuring packages. So yeah, maybe spot that that's exactly what we are doing here. We're moving files from one package to another package name, and that means that all those files, libraries, are getting lost in upgrades.
Right.
That's not a particular good outlook. And the best part about that is there's no way to order these transitions to avoid that interference. If you do the one first and the other later, or the other way around, it breaks in the same way on the Bookworm to Trixie upgrade.
Okay.
So please be careful and upload all that stuff to experimental.
Okay. So I think that was the next, somewhere. Yeah, there was a question. So the discussion, there was quite a lot about whether this should go through experimental or whether it should be done directly on unstable. And I must admit, Guillaume and Steve talking to each other, I kind of lost the comprehension. So I didn't really follow, A, what all the ifs and buts were, and B, which would be a better plan. I'm not entirely sure that that's been decided. Well, I think that will be decided imminently, basically by the people doing it. So unless anyone has anything significant to say about... So you think experimental will be... basically go through all the new Q stuff into experimental, and I think there's some magic for going, we'll just move everything from experimental to unstable rather than uploading it all again, right? Or do we in fact all have to just upload it all twice, because we just tested it there? Right. So it's twice as many uploads, but the second one is basically just mechanical. Well, they're both pretty mechanical.
You can do some script.
Yeah.
Some scripting. I have some questions. You said you are going to coordinate with this with FTP master,
That's
which
the
is
idea.
great because you are going to have to go through new. Please also coordinate with the release team if you want to get into testing and in stable.
So is the release team in charge of the transition tracker thing, in fact?
Yes.
Right, okay. So FTP Masters is the new
And being,
part of this.
being an MUs are also scheduled by the release team.
Right. So I should have said FTP
And then
Masters and release
helping
team.
get all the packages migrated together into testing, which is kind of a problem, I think, because you are renaming binary packages, but not the actual library shared objects, right? Those are staying
Yes.
with the same name, so you need conflicts on the older packages, and that's going to make transitions much more complicated, because the old binary packages need to be removed at the same time. So everything needs to migrate at the same time.
I believe that is the idea.
Yeah, it's a little harder. It's also going to be somewhat of a problem, possibly, for upgrades from Bookworm to Trixie, because suddenly apt and deep package are going to have a harder time finding a solution to the upgrade. So
Because there's
maybe
a
we
big
can get some
transition
input from apt.
Is there
folks.
anything we can do to make that... I mean, that should all just work. No?
Yeah.
Please comment on the experimental part.
Okay.
It's not about clearing the new queue, but about giving me some chance to detect that breakage and file bugs about it before it propagates to unstable. So unless you prefer magically having all your libraries disappear from your file system, please do go via experimental.
Okay. So you think we should do it all in experimental and then, like, wait a month,
3 days
3 days?
for his script to find any possible issues with
okay.
user merge.
So,
One other thing, so you said that i386 is going to stay with the older TimeT ABI for compatibility.
yes.
So this is mostly about RML and RMHF.
Yes.
Could we maybe remove RML and postpone the RMHF problem until
I
there's
think we can
not a
postpone
lot of
it any
hardware?
longer. We do kind of need to do this sooner rather than later, and you kind of this is the sort of thing you want to do early in the cycle, right? So it's like now.
Yeah,
it stops
sure.
being early soon.
Sure, I mean postpone it like 15 years until there's no RMHF hardware and we don't have to do this.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the other approach is to do nothing.
Yeah.
That is a
Or
possibility.
we could introduce, or let the people that have who care introduce a different architecture. That you discarded that idea for RMHF.
Yeah, I think the enough people that are still using RMHF would quite like it to have this fixed, several years ago, but now we'll have to do. So I think there's quite a strong demand to move this forward.
If you're using RMHF, the chances are that you, at this point, the chances are that you plan to use the same hardware for a very long time and don't particularly want to upgrade to a completely new architecture in the middle of your production deployment.
So yeah, whilst it's very annoying for Debian FTP masters and release teams, I think we do have to do this.
So you're talking about not changing the library so name and not moving, and therefore not. So the new library packages will conflict with the old library packages. That means there is no correct installation order on a user system through this transition that does not involve deinstalling, like almost everything, I think. I mean, I don't think this is how we usually do it.
My understanding is that this is how we usually do it, but there's two flavors of usually do it, right? There's simple transitions and with a SO name bump, and there's ABI transitions. I mean, when I say we're not changing the SO name, we're not. I think the idea is not to change every package, but I think it's equivalent to an SO name bump. But yeah, this is where I get really vague about how this actually works.
So,
So, we should have Mr. Langasek standing here because he actually understands this shit.
The mic's off.
I think the prior art here is long double transitions and C102, the old C++ transitions, which affected a relative minority of packages and were... The thing I would be concerned about is that the prior art here was in relative leaves in library terms. It wasn't particularly deep down the stack in most cases, and so if it was rough in conflicts kinds of ways, that was sort of tolerable.
C102 was C++ things only, right? So that's
and long double
not
was
the core
mostly
C library.
mathematical packages,
yeah.
that sort of thing.
So this is the sort of transition we've done before, but it affects more core stuff, which is more likely to produce trouble in apps.
I think that's going to cause very bad trouble on end-user systems because lots of important stuff will be deinstalled, maybe too much stuff that you can reinstall it again afterwards, and also deinstalling huge amounts of the system like Perl and reinstalling it. Just
don't we do that all the time? But we kind of do it a piece at a time rather than a big chunk.
You won't. In order to do this, right, the new Perl.deb contains a Perl interpreter that is incompatible with the old libperl.so. And the new libperl.so conflicts with the old libperl.so. So the only way to do this is to deinstall Perl. That's not...
And all the Perl packages.
And everything that depends on Perl, including all the maintainer scripts and debconf. And this is just terrible.
Can you replace these conflicts to get yourself out of this? Can you...
Well, you can kind of wing it and hope that the executables in memory will continue on while the world changes under their feet. If anything goes wrong, you'll be stuffed.
Isn't that how libc updates and SSHD work every time? And it's surprising no. That's different, is it?
No.
Processes are different because the time when that matters is when you exec.
Okay,
so I think you should do this with a so name change to the library and not conflicts. And then you will be able to install the new libperl.so.
Isn't it difficult to bump the SO name of a library where upstream hasn't done that?
The upstream will hate you, but we've done that before for these kind of transitions before, and there's not really any sensible way around that.
Okay.
Other than, the other thing that happens is old binaries randomly stop working, like the binaries you have in user local that you compiled last week, and then you do your system upgrade, and now they randomly core dump because the time tiers are wrong size.
Yeah.
This is all terrible. Don't do this.
Okay.
So the thing I was going to ask was, we're not transitioning i386 as you say, but we're also changing the package names on all architectures to append T64.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't this going to confuse the bejesus out of i386 users who remain, who now have package names with T64 on the end of them that are not timed T64?
Yeah.
Maybe the answer is deal, but it seems non-trivial.
I don't think we have a way of not doing that, apart from leaving i386. Not special casing i386.
Well, the question was, is it at all viable? We have in the past done. We have in the past had per architecture runtime library package names. libc's runtime library package name was for a long time distinct on different architectures and may still be. Is that viable here to make the situation a little less confusing?
I guess so.
I don't know how bad the packaging consequences end up being if you try to do it across several thousand packages.
Yeah. Well, it's several hundred. We're changing the names of 500 packages. It's only the libraries that change, right? None of the depending 6,000 change. That's just rebuilds. So there's 500 things we have to worry about, which is quite a lot, but it's not a totally infeasible number if we had to change something.
And it doesn't actually change the ABI on anything other than ARM, right?
Well, to change the ABI on all the 32-bit architectures that
right.
currently have a 32-bit time T.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure anybody cares much if we break old MIPS a bit. I mean, I think the more serious risk actually is stuff that doesn't build on obscure architectures we don't care about, and we end up having to fix that. There's a couple more things to mention, and then maybe we can go back to arguing about how to do this. Or maybe it's more productive. It's possibly more productive to argue about how to do this, actually. The other thing is that just to add to the pile is this. Modern C, so implicit function declarations are now deemed to be bad, and they're going away anyway in another transition because LLVM 14 onwards declares them to be an error, and GCC will from next year, apparently. So there's a separate project trying to fix that, but it's sort of tied in to the glibc time T thing, because if you use implicit functions like this, it's possible to end up not noticing the macro that glibc put in to give you the nice new functions by default. So there is probably a set of software which needs to go through this transition, which will also break even when you set the magic variables. Old stuff, basically. It's like stuff written in C from 20 years ago style, maybe older than that. So we should probably set this error thing as well while we're doing this, just so that basically we'll notice if anything is doing this, and it's one more bug to deal with.
For everything, please.
Yeah, so I think the question is, like, should we just turn that on everywhere, like yesterday? So we should tell dpackage to just do that.
I mean, we should find out what upgrade.
Yes, yeah. A rebuild is in order.
I thought that some of that rebuild had happened already. I'm sure that I've had people file bug reports in some of my older and crustier packages about this.
Yeah.
Somebody's trying it.
So Gentoo's already got 568 in their bug tracker, and that URL is a Fedora project. So yeah, there is a lot of work going on this, and it has been done, and may well have gone upstream and come back to us already. So hopefully a lot of this has already been dealt with, and we won't even notice. I don't know how much is left, like in packages that are only still around in Debian because they're so old and crufty. We do have a lot of that stuff. Anyway, yeah, so that's just another little wrinkle. Oh, so ideally we wouldn't tie these things together, but I'm not sure we're going to get much choice. Yeah, that's it really. So back to this argument about if you don't like doing it the way Steve suggested, what should we do instead?
So contrary to what Ian was saying a couple of minutes ago, as someone who deals with cross-distribution ABIs and cross-distribution binary software and that sort of thing, every time we have done a Debian-specific so name, it has come back to haunt us for like a decade. Can we please not do that? Mm-hmm. Because the so name is a property of the upstream software.
Exactly.
And if the ABI is different for different build options of the same source, there's kind of no good representation for that. And, like, we have two equally bad options for what we change the so name to, because if we do, like, .0d or something like that to indicate Debian-specific so name not compatible with upstream, then like half the build systems can't even do that because they expect a number, and the other half will make your life very hard to get there. Or equally, if we just bump the integer, upstream will later bump the integer to the same value with a different meaning, and it's just a disaster, and can we please not?
I'm inclined to agree with you. That sounds... I mean, systems that don't upgrade is quite bad, but that's quite bad too.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And systems that don't upgrade, at least they only don't upgrade once.
Here today, yeah.
Whereas systems that are subtly incompatible and claim to be compatible, or that are actually compatible but claim not to be,
for 15
are
years.
with us for decades.
Yeah.
Like, I am having to deal with this because we thought it was a good idea to bump the so name of libcurl over some technicality.
I mean, maybe we
15 years ago, and then on another occasion we didn't bump the so name when upstream did. And
I mean, the problem is that
I have
a lot of
written some
upstream,
horrible, horrible code to work around this.
far too
I am
many
not proud of
upstreams
it.
don't understand so names either, which is a bit sad these days. I wonder if it's worth doing some of these upstream in order to reduce the size of
You kind of can't. Because the upstream does not know what compiler you will be using. The only way you can do this upstream is if the upstream declares that, right, libfoo.so.3 is undefined time t size, libfoo.so.4 will always be times 64 and puts the glue in their build system to force times 64. And for some upstream projects that carefully don't have time t in their ABI at all, you could unconditionally put that in, like I've done that for dbus. It changes the type that's used internally, but the ABI doesn't change, as it happens. But if it is in your ABI, then you kind of have to coordinate that between every distribution in the world and make sure that none of them patch your package to move it back. Otherwise, you have the same problem all over again.
Yes. Okay. Ian? Sorry, Steve. Yeah.
So we have a real problem here with cruft that should have already been thrown out or fixed years ago. Nothing in Debian should not be 64-bit file size clean, but we're still picking up on this after a decade. Nothing in Debian should be using implicit function declarations. I mean, for crying out loud, that was bad practice in the 80s. You know, I found these years back when I was looking through a list of libraries and things to see what we needed to optimize for ARM64. And I found bugs on some of these things, clearly not enough. And anything that doesn't build cleanly with the function declaration warnings and errors turned on just needs binning. It needs shooting in the head. It's broken.
So why haven't we turned it on ages ago? I mean, it's a fairly simple change. We could have made the depackage at any
It's something
point,
we
but
probably should have done, but it's only really come out now
Yeah.
that upstream tool chains are starting to say, you know what, this is crap. We need to force this.
Yeah.
We could have done it too, and then we'd have been arguing about this 10 years ago.
It was work nobody particularly wanted to do.
So I'm firmly of the opinion, based on the conversations we've been having today, that we're actually looking at the wrong path, and we should just rebootstrap ARMHF and be done with it, and let everything else assume a 64-bit time T. i386, fine. You know, I think everybody's agreed. ARMHF has a future, but just call it ARMHF2 or whatever, and don't break
call
the
it
rest
ARM.
We could.
No, actually, we could call it ARM32.
We could call it Bruce for all I care, but you know,
May I?
But by all means, break that. That is a bounded number of systems, and let's leave the rest alone. Let's not.
The problem
break
with that
them.
is that we've got to persuade the toolchain people and kernel people to have a new triplet.
Yeah, and we've done that before. It's
Yeah.
one new port. It's not breaking everything.
But
on
nobody
all
else in the world
architectures.
thinks this is a good idea, and I think that could be quite difficult because you have to get them to agree. They'll go, just rebuild it for the new thing. You don't need a new triplet. And we'll go, please come have a new triplet. You know, we could be here for years, is the problem with that.
So-
I mean, I don't disagree, but I'm saying that's why we're not doing that.
The kernel people don't care about the kernel.
Yes.
True.
Yeah, the kernel people
Toolchain
don't
people.
care about triplet. as
Toolchain
Mark
and
says.
GDC, yeah.
Yeah, and we talk to toolchain people all the time. Anyway, I'll hand over to somebody
Yeah.
else.
I think Ian,
So if you don't, like Simon says, I mean, there is a problem with diverging so names upstream. One possibility would be a hybrid approach where we take the packages that we think are critical that can't be deinstalled during upgrade, like the double float transition was done on user systems by deinstalling that software, and we could do that again, but we can't deinstall Perl. So there's some boundary somewhere, and you could say these packages will deinstall, and these packages will bump the so name. And probably we can afford to have our own custom so name for Perl, and
apt.
and we have to think about, like, you know, where that boundary could be drawn, and maybe we could do some kind of hybrid approach.
That sounds plausible. It was sorry. It was,
things to follow up with Steve's points. The first one on the implicit function declarations, the issues there fall into two categories. You get the failure to build from source. Those are really easy to detect, and those aren't so much the issue. I mean, there's a lot of engineering work to go fix all the thousands of packages that should have been removed 10 years ago, but the bigger problem is a whole load of autoconf tests now fail because they were implicitly just non-including headers that they should have done. Nobody noticed because it linked fine, and now suddenly that test fails and you get silent breakage at runtime because that feature you depended on wasn't automatically detected anymore. And so that's where a lot of the engineering work has gone in on the Red Hat side to try and find all these effectively by doing build with and without the flag and seeing whether the configure script gave the same output. And so that's why you see a lot of the issues. And those maybe autoconf tests that, you wrote 15 years ago and the software still evolved, but nobody went and fixed that because nobody knew it was even a problem.
Yes, it's mostly autoconf is a problem.
On the triple side, do we necessarily need it to actually be a new triple? We have the concept of multi-arch paths in Debian, which don't exactly correspond to upstream triples anyway. There would be the option to have a specific time64 multi-arch triple that is different, like we see with i386 versus i686 and things, where you can have a separate Debian multi-arch thing that is your time64T, but from the toolchain's perspective, it doesn't care what time T is. It can still use the old GNU ABI HF thing. And as long as we in Debian ensure that when you use the compiler for the right architecture, everything works, that should be okay, right? Because we have we have our Debian triple generally, I think, on the front of the GCC package, not the upstream triple for the cross compilers. Yeah. So we can put in the flags that we need for the specific architectures there.
That's slightly scary, but you're right. I think that could work. Helmut's making faces behind you.
Also,
I worry about the multi-lib aspect. Sorry,
well, that's why you put it in a separate multi-lib is
the problem is because we have multi-arch and multi-lib, this all gets horribly complicated.
Yeah, libs 32 T64 or something. On the SO name front, if you did want to automate doing it, you could look at doing something like patch shelf to go in and manually change the SO name in the binary. It would be awkward, but you could probably do it somewhere in deb helper and write some horror code. More awkward when you have a package which internally depends on the library itself that it just built, so you need to enumerate all those things, but you could do it with some horrible grep to check that you didn't. You're shaking your head, but in theory you could do it, right?
Yeah. I believe that is technically possible.
And with that, I'll let Helmut say why he hates what I just said.
Let me repeat something that Plugwish said. It's that Perl bumps SO name anyway. So for Perl, we actually end up not having that much of a problem, at least for the Bookworm to Trixie upgrade. Yes. The other thing is, can we please try to look at this in 64-bit and 32-bit perspective separated? So when we do this on 64-bit, yes, we do rename the library packages. We do not rename the libraries, and we do not change the ABI. And the renamed library packages will provide the original names.
That's right. Yeah.
So all the compatibility there is retained, and it'll be breaks and replaces. And except for that user merge interaction, it'll mostly just go unnoticed. And all the breakage.
So I didn't explain that part very well, but that is the plan. Yeah.
Yeah, and all the breakage that we get regarding SO name changes, if any, or conflicting library packages is restricted to actually affected 32-bit architectures. That's where it happens. So it's not like AMD64 will have that much of an impact.
Okay. I think we're out of time now, so I think that was useful.
So I'd just like to make one comment slightly off topic compared to the conversation we've had on the 2038 issue at a different level. It is currently, in my opinion at the moment, easier to build more new embedded systems as an inexperienced person as it ever has been. And there are lots of organizations, companies, building smart devices that are running Linux that they traditionally would not market. So you go back 10 years, they wouldn't have even thought of having electronics in their portfolio. But now they're building smart systems. So just as a thought, as your organisations or you yourself are purchasing new devices for managing buildings, managing your home, etc., maybe it's worth asking the 2038 question.
Yes, true. That is a good point. Right. Well, thank you all. That was interesting, I think.